Germany, April 1945. The air above the Rhine was fractured, shredded by vapor trails, the sky trembling with speed. On Luftwaffe radar, one Allied contact moved faster than anything with a propeller had a right to. The technician stared, blinking at the green blip that streaked across the screen. "That must be a glitch," one said. It wasn't. 30,000 feet up, a lone P-51 Mustang cut through the thin air like a knife of light. Inside, Lieutenant Jack Rains gritted his teeth, his oxygen mask rattling as the altimeter trembled near the red line. The engine screamed, a sound deeper, angrier than any Merlin had ever made. His hands fought the vibration, his instruments flickered half dead. Behind him, the contrails of three Me-262s curved closer, their jet turbines roaring, their 30mm cannons flashing. "Eagle 1, you're being overtaken," the radio barked. Rains keyed his mic, breath ragged. "Negative, control. They're not catching me. I'm leaving them." On the ground, Luftwaffe pilots couldn't believe what they were hearing. They'd been told the Me-262 was untouchable, the symbol of a new world, jet-age supremacy. But through the clouds, the silver streak in front of them was accelerating. A propeller plane. In the German cockpit, Lieutenant Franz Bremer cursed, pushing the throttle to its stop. His jet shuddered. "Unmöglich," he hissed. Impossible. The Mustang ahead shimmered in the sunlight, and then, with a burst of contrail vapor, it simply vanished from his gun sight. Rains didn't know what speed he was doing anymore. The airframe groaned. His canopy cracked along one edge. The altimeter spun past 32,000 feet. He could feel the stick stiffening, the horizon warping, the moment when air stopped behaving like air. For a second, everything went quiet. Then, like the sky itself tore open, the Mustang punched through turbulence so violent it shook his teeth. The nose dropped, the wings flexed, but the forbidden engine kept pulling, the Merlin's roar bending into a shriek of pure defiance. Back at base, a ground operator shouted over the radio, "You've just gone past 700. Static answered. Then Rains' voice came through, trembling but alive. "Tell Malloy, his damn engine flies." Below him, the three German jets fell behind, powerless to keep up. One by one, they peeled away, engines choking in the thin air. The pilot of the lead Me-262 later reported, "It was not flying, it was a lightning bolt." When Rains finally leveled off, his gauges were unreadable, his cockpit fogged with oil mist. He was somewhere over the Black Forest, alone, the sky behind him empty. He exhaled slowly, the vibration still humming through his bones. He had just done what no one believed possible. A piston plane outpacing the fastest jets of the Third Reich by 150 miles per hour. He didn't know yet that his engine, a forbidden experiment built by one mechanic with no authorization, had just broken the limits of aviation. In a war ruled by numbers and machines, one man had rewritten the equation. By 1944, the German Luftwaffe had convinced itself it was untouchable. The Messerschmitt Me-262, sleek, fast, and futuristic, was the pride of the Reich. Every propaganda reel showed it as proof that German science had leapfrogged the world. Pilots called it the Silver Swallow, the first true jet-powered predator. It could climb faster, dive steeper, and strike before Allied planes even saw it coming. To Allied command, the jet was an existential threat. Briefings were filled with panic graphs, comparisons that made the P-51 look prehistoric. The Mustang topped out at 437 mph. The Me-262, 540 mph level flight, with bursts that could hit 560 under dive compression. The math didn't lie. The piston era was finished. Every squadron heard the same message. Do not engage jets directly. Climb if possible. Retreat if necessary. But for men like Sergeant Frank Malloy, a mechanic stationed at RAF Leiston with the 357th Fighter Group. That defeatism felt like heresy. He didn't believe in surrendering to an equation. If it's got air in front of it, he used to say, there's a way to make it move faster. Malloy's contempt for the jet myth wasn't arrogance, it was instinct. He'd grown up racing jalopies on the Kansas plains, coaxing life from junk engines. The Army saw a grease-stained troublemaker. His pilots saw a miracle worker. Where others saw the Me-262 as a glimpse of the future, Malloy saw a challenge. They think they've got the sky, he'd tell the boys in the hangar, but they still breathe the same damn air we do. He studied every report on German jet operations he could get his hands on. Most of them read the same: incredible power, catastrophic reliability. The Me-262's Jumo 004 engines lasted barely 25 flight hours. The turbines shredded themselves under strain. A burst of machine gun fire could tear one apart. The jet was fast but fragile, a predator with glass bones. Malloy started asking questions no one else dared. Why couldn't the Mustang be pushed harder? Why was its engine, the legendary Rolls-Royce Merlin V1657, capped at safe limits? He'd seen pilots come back from dogfights with half their manifolds melted still alive. He knew the engine could take punishment. The manual said the Merlin was rated for 61 inches of manifold pressure at war emergency power. Malloy wanted to see what would happen if you doubled that. When his commanding officer found him one night tweaking a supercharger's bypass valve, he barked, "You trying to kill someone, Sergeant?" Malloy just smiled. "No, sir. Trying to keep us from being extinct." The brass laughed. The other mechanics rolled their eyes. But in the corner of the hangar, surrounded by wrenches, coffee tins, and the scent of oil and ozone, Malloy kept working. Because deep down, he understood something the manuals didn't. Speed wasn't just numbers. It was defiance made visible. And while the Germans worshipped their jets, the Americans still had something the Luftwaffe never would: men crazy enough to break their own rules. That's how the myth of jet supremacy began to die. Not from better factories, but from one outlaw mechanic with a wrench, a heartbeat, and the refusal to believe the war was already lost in the air. RAF Leiston, England. February 1945. Snow drifted between the rows of P-51 Mustangs, their wings glinting under floodlights as ground crews worked through the night. Most of them followed the manual. Torque settings exact, fuel mixtures precise, nothing improvised. All except one. Down in Hangar 12, Sergeant Frank Malloy worked alone. His sleeves rolled up, engine parts scattered across a table like puzzle pieces. He wasn't supposed to be there. His shift had ended 6 hours earlier, but the war didn't care about schedules, and neither did he. Malloy was a contradiction wrapped in grease and brilliance. A Kansas farmhand turned Army mechanic. He spoke to engines like they were old friends. "You don't fix them," he'd say. "You listen till they tell you what hurts." Pilots loved him. Command hated him. He'd learned machinery not from textbooks but from desperation, patching broken tractors, balancing engines with nothing but a wrench and gut feeling. When he joined the Air Corps, he expected the same freedom. Instead, he found paperwork, rules, and men terrified of breaking them. That didn't last long. Within a month, Malloy had been written up twice, once for unauthorized modification of intake valves, once for use of non-standard lubricants. But his planes flew longer, climbed higher, and came home with fewer failures. He'd laugh whenever a superior scolded him. If the book could win a war, he'd say, we'd drop it on Berlin. By early 45, the talk around the base was that the Luftwaffe's jets were unstoppable. Pilots whispered about the Me-262, how it could appear out of nowhere, fire, and vanish before you could blink. Malloy listened, chewed his cigarette, and muttered, "Then we just have to stop blinking." He became obsessed. For days, he tore apart the spare Merlin engines, pushing tolerances past sanity. He'd hand-grind piston rings for tighter compression, polish the crankshaft bearings until they shone like mirrors. and retime the ignition until the spark almost outran itself. The other mechanics called him the madman in the hangar. Once, a young corporal asked him what he was doing. Malloy didn't look up. Trying to make an engine breathe faster than God intended. His experiments grew bolder. He stole fuel lines from wrecked Spitfires, scavenged compressor parts from P-38 Lightnings, even remachined a supercharger housing with a file and a prayer. He'd test the results by firing up the engine at midnight, the roar echoing across the base like thunder. One night, his commanding officer stormed in. "Sergeant Malloy, you'll blow the whole field up." Malloy grinned through the smoke. "Not if I get it right." His reputation spread. Some pilots avoided him thinking he was cursed. Others, the daring ones, started requesting his engines. They said they ran hotter, climbed faster, and somehow sounded different, like they were alive. In March, one of those pilots, Lieutenant Jack Rains, stopped by his hangar. "You're the guy making planes faster than the Germans," he said. Malloy wiped his hands on a rag. "I'm the guy trying to prove physics has bad handwriting." Rains laughed. "You got something for me to fly?" Malloy's eyes lit up. "Not yet, but I will." Behind him, under a tarp, sat his latest project, a modified Merlin he called the Forbidden Engine. It wasn't in the Army's records. It wasn't in any manual. It was built from scraps, intuition, and a refusal to stop believing that propellers could still win a jet war. And soon, it was going to fly. By the time March winds swept across Leiston, the hangar floor looked like a crime scene against regulation. Disassembled carburetors, hand-drawn fuel maps, a supercharger rotor polished to a mirror finish using toothpaste and sandpaper. Every mechanic who passed by whispered the same thing: Malloy's lost it. But he hadn't lost it. He'd found something. For weeks, Malloy had been running secret tests on captured Mi-262 fuel samples smuggled in by a liaison officer from intelligence. The Germans were using a volatile mix of kerosene and synthetic additives designed for turbine jets. It burned too hot for piston engines, in theory. Malloy, however, didn't believe in theory. He believed in, let's see if it explodes first. He began experimenting with a hybrid brew. Aviation-grade 100-octane fuel spiked with benzene and ethanol, stolen from a grounded bomber's reserve tank. The mixture smelled like paint thinner and death. When ignited, it burned 12% hotter and 8% faster, enough to push the Merlin engine beyond its red line. He called it the outlaw mix. One night, he scrawled the new ratios on a piece of scrap aluminum, scratched Malloy blend, do not use, across it, and bolted it to the test stand. Then, with only a flashlight and a prayer, he hit the starter. The hangar shook. The engine screamed. The air shimmered with heat waves as the exhaust tore through the silence. Gauges spun past limits. A rivet popped. Another. Then the roar evened out. Not breaking, not detonating. Just holding steady like a heartbeat. Malloy stood there, eyes wide, a cigarette burning down to his fingers. He whispered, "You're alive." When the test ended, the Merlin block was scorched but intact. The cylinders read clean. The compression curve was off the charts. Against every law of metallurgy, it had survived. But there was a problem. If command found out, he'd be court-martialed before sunrise. The Army didn't tolerate freelance chemistry. They barely tolerated him. So he did what he always did. He lied. The next morning, Lieutenant Rains walked in. "You said you'd have something fast for me." Malloy tossed him a clipboard. "You want to go fast? This is fast." "What did you do?" "Nothing that needs a report." Rains grinned. "Good, because I don't like reports." Over the next week, they modified Rains's P-51 in secret. Malloy recalibrated the fuel injectors, widened the exhaust headers, and rewired the supercharger clutch to engage manually. It wasn't a factory Mustang anymore. It was a street racer with wings. He'd replaced precision with instinct, engineering with feel, manuals with madness. The other mechanics watched from the doorway, whispering, That thing's gonna blow itself apart. Malloy just said, maybe. But it'll get there first. When they rolled the plane onto the runway, its polished aluminum gleamed like a blade. The propeller spun faster than regulation allowed, the air vibrating like a warning. Malloy crossed his arms. She'll either fly or make history as the fastest explosion in Europe. Rains smiled, strapped in, and throttled forward. The roar shattered the dawn. The P-51 lunged down the strip, lifted, and in seconds vanished into a silver streak against the sky. Malloy watched the contrail curve upward, thin and impossible. He didn't need instruments to know what had just happened. He'd built the fastest propeller-driven aircraft in the world, and the first that might just outrun a jet. 2 days later, the rumor started spreading like wildfire through the base. A Mustang had broken through 700 miles per hour in a dive, something no piston aircraft was supposed to survive. Some said it was a barroom story. Others swore they'd heard the sonic crack themselves. At the center of it all was Lieutenant Jack Rains, pale-faced, wild-eyed, and grinning like a man who'd just raced the devil and won. He landed that morning with his P-51 trembling like a living creature, the wings quivering under strain, the fuselage streaked with heat distortion. When he stepped out, his flight suit was soaked through, and his oxygen mask hung loose around his neck. He didn't say a word for a full minute. Then he just muttered, "She hit 720 before the altimeter blacked out." The flight officers laughed him off. "Impossible. Air drag would rip it apart." But Malloy didn't laugh. He stood there, cigarette dangling, eyes locked on the engine cowling. He already knew. He'd checked the stress points the night before. The fuel mix, the air compression, the supercharger curve, all of it created a power peak that didn't make sense on paper but somehow held together in the air. The Mustang had entered transonic speed, flirting with a sound barrier no piston plane was built to touch. Malloy pulled the engine logs later that night. RPMs maxed at 3,400, 800 past the factory limit. Oil temps had climbed to 286 degrees. The manifold pressure gauge was stuck past redline. And yet, when they pulled the cowling off, the Merlin looked fine. Burned, yes. Scorched. But intact. He turned to Rains. "You just flew faster than physics," Rains grinned. "Then I'll try again tomorrow." Command wasn't so amused. Word of the Outlaw flight reached Group HQ within 24 hours. A major arrived demanding answers. Malloy stood there, hands still black with oil, pretending to be dumb. "Who authorized this test?" the major barked. Rains shrugged. "Sir, I think the wind authorized it." Malloy nearly choked, holding back laughter. The major stared at the engine, ran his hand over the scuffed cowling, and said, "Whatever this is, it's over." But it wasn't. The story of Rains's 720 mph Mustang spread across the airfields of Europe like a ghost legend. Pilots whispered about it in mess halls. Engineers debated it in hangars. The Luftwaffe even intercepted Allied radio chatter claiming a prop plane outran a jet. And for the Germans, that was more than just rumor. It was humiliation. Because 2 days after Rains's flight, a Me-262 squadron intercepted his group near Kassel. Rains dove, throttled, and pulled away. The German pilots couldn't catch him. One even reported, "The American propeller plane vanished upward, impossible acceleration." Malloy read the translated intelligence report weeks later and smirked. "Impossible's just a setting," he said. From then on, he became legend in secret, the mechanic who built a plane faster than God's patience. The Army never officially acknowledged the test. The logs disappeared. The Malloy blend was scrubbed from the records. But pilots began coming to him quietly, asking, "Can you make mine breathe like Rains's?" He never said yes. But they noticed the smell of fuel in his hangar. That same sharp, burning scent of defiance. Every war has its miracle. Theirs came from a hangar, not a laboratory. The morning after Rains' flight, Malloy sat in the corner of the maintenance hangar, running the math on a notepad streaked with oil. The numbers didn't make sense. They didn't even pretend to. According to every engineering manual in the U.S. Army Air Forces, the P-51 Mustang should have disintegrated at 580 mph. Its propeller tips alone would have gone supersonic, shredding themselves to vapor. Yet Rains had punched through 700, maybe even 720, and come back alive. Malloy scrawled 3 lines in the margin. Compression ratio, 8.51, illegal. Fuel octane, Estental 140 plus, impossible. Result, plane still flies. He underlined still flies twice. When he took the figures to the engineering board a week later, they called it mechanical delusion. The head engineer from Wright Field said flatly, "No piston aircraft can exceed 0.83 Mach without catastrophic failure." Malloy smirked. Then maybe it didn't know. He wasn't trying to be poetic. He meant it. The data showed his modified supercharger created a pressure curve that ramped instead of peaked, feeding air faster the harder the engine pushed. Essentially, it cheated drag. At high altitude, that meant acceleration instead of stall, a self-feeding loop of speed that no slide rule could explain. When they reran the tests on paper, the analyst calculated that the engine's theoretical horsepower under that mix hit 2,480 HP, nearly 60% more than stock. They called it a computational error. Malloy called it proof. He didn't care if it broke rules. The sky didn't read rule books. Then came the kicker. Using flight recorder telemetry, Malloy calculated that at 29,000 feet, Rains' Mustang had climbed 1,200 feet in 7 seconds during the dive recovery. That was jet performance, from a piston engine. Someone at HQ stamped the report, classified, unverified claim. The data vanished into archives, but the whispers didn't. Pilots began asking around, "Who's the mechanic with the outlaw blend?" And soon the legend started spreading faster than the planes themselves. British engineers visiting the base brought calipers and clipboards. One quietly admitted, "If your figures are real, Sergeant, your engine achieved thrust-to-weight parity. That's jet territory." Malloy only replied, "Then jets have catching up to do." By April 1945, the Allies owned the skies, and rumors about super Mustangs made their way to Luftwaffe intelligence. German analysts dismissed it as propaganda, until one Me-262 pilot returned, shaken, claiming a Mustang had outclimbed him. "It wasn't speed," he said in interrogation later. "It was madness." For Malloy, that was the only confirmation he needed. He'd proved what he always believed, that genius doesn't come from rules but from risk. When his crew asked how he'd done it, he scribbled on the wall with chalk, "Speed x faith plus fire." And for a brief moment, faith and fire were enough to bend physics. April 9th, 1945, over the German countryside near Magdeburg. The sky was a silver maze of contrails and gunfire. Rains and his squadron, the 352nd Fighter Group, were on escort duty for B-17 striking the last synthetic oil plants east of the Rhine. They'd been briefed to expect flak, not jets. But the Luftwaffe was desperate now. Radar picked up fast-moving blips climbing from the east. Me-2662s, 12 of them. Pure speed and vengeance, Germany's final gamble in the air. The B-17 formation commander's voice cracked over the radio. "Bandits, 10 o'clock high. Closing fast." The Mustangs throttled up. But everyone knew the math. The 262s could dive, fire, and vanish at over 540 mph, faster than the escort could even turn, except one. Rains's P-51 wasn't standard. It had Malloy's outlaw engine, the forbidden fuel mix, the throttle wired past regulation. While the rest of the squadron banked defensively, Rains rolled inverted and dove straight toward the jets. "Rains, break off!" the radio screamed. "You'll never catch them!" But Rains wasn't chasing. He was baiting. At 28,000 feet, one Me-262 overshot, its 30mm cannons flaring. Rains snapped into a vertical climb and didn't stall. The engine howled, a living animal. The altimeter spun. From below, his wingman couldn't believe it. The Mustang was climbing with a jet. The Me-262 pilot, stunned, tried to bank away, but his jet compressor surged under stress. That split-second hesitation was fatal. Rains rolled, lined up his K-14 gun sight, and fired a 1-second burst. The tracers arced perfectly into the German's left engine. A bloom of fire tore through the sky. "Got one!" Rains shouted, his voice barely audible through the oxygen hiss. Malloy, listening over ground comms back at base, just smiled. Knew she'd bite. But the fight wasn't over. 2 more jets broke through the bomber's defensive ring, slashing at the formation. One burst shredded a B-17's right wing. Flames trailed like ribbons. Rains dove again, nearly vertical, hitting 670 km/h as the outlaw mix pushed the Merlin past red line. The stick felt like concrete, the wings screaming under strain. He fired again, impossibly fast, almost blind through the vibration, and clipped the second jet's tailplane. The Me-262 tumbled, then vanished in a spiral of black smoke. The surviving Germans broke off. They couldn't understand what they'd just seen. To them, it looked like the impossible, a piston plane outturning and outclimbing jet fighters. The myth was real now, written in gun camera footage and wreckage on the ground. When Rains landed hours later, the P-51's engine was literally melting from within. 2 pistons had cracked, 1 valve fused shut, and the supercharger casing was split. But the plane had flown, fought, and lived. Malloy walked up, wiped his hands on his overalls, and said, "You bent her near to hell, but she held." Rains grinned, exhausted. "She didn't fly, Frank. She ripped time open." The rest of the mechanics gathered around, staring at the battered engine like it was holy. Someone asked, "What do we tell HQ?" Malloy lit another cigarette and said, "Tell them she ran on regulation fuel, and the pilot had angels on payroll." For a few seconds, the hangar went silent. Everyone there knew they'd just watched a line in aviation history quietly move forward. Not in a lab, not in a boardroom, but in a hangar where rules came second to survival. And in that silence, the roar of one outlaw engine still seemed to echo. Within 48 hours of the Magdeburg mission, the myth became a classified problem. The 8th Air Force Command didn't like miracles they couldn't explain, and even less the kind that broke regulations. A courier jeep rolled up to Leiston with a sealed envelope marked, "Urgent, Engineering Compliance Review." Malloy knew exactly what that meant. They were coming for his engine. By dawn, a convoy of technical officers arrived with clipboards and sterile gloves. They surrounded Rains's battered P-51 like it was a crime scene. One major squinted at the exhaust ports, then at Malloy. "This isn't standard issue. What fuel mix did you run?" Malloy didn't blink. "The one in the manual." The major wasn't buying it. "You've got signs of overpressure. Detonation patterns like nitro compounds. We don't make that kind of fuel." "Sergeant?" Malloy smiled. "Guess the Krauts did." Behind him, Rains stood silently, arms crossed. He wasn't about to sell out the man who'd saved his life, and possibly rewritten aerodynamics. For 3 days, investigators combed through the hangar. They confiscated notebooks, scrap parts, and even the ashtray beside Malloy's workbench. They labeled everything Exhibit A through F. Malloy just called it Tuesday. But what the officers didn't understand was this. There was no blueprint, no secret part. The power wasn't in the engine. It was in the tuning. The infinitesimal adjustments to timing, the half-degree bends in the fuel lines, the unrecorded instincts of a man who could hear balance through vibration. You can't confiscate intuition. On the 4th day, the major confronted him again. "This plane exceeds performance parameters by 38%. Either you tampered with it or you're lying." Malloy exhaled smoke and said, "You forgot the third option. Maybe I made it better." Rains nearly laughed out loud. That afternoon, orders came down from higher command. Raines's P-51 was to be shipped to Wright Field for testing. Malloy wasn't allowed to touch it again. Effective immediately, Sergeant Malloy is reassigned to logistics maintenance. No further flight modifications authorized. He stood there, jaw tight, as they towed his plane away. Months of work, erased by regulation. But even bureaucrats couldn't bury what had happened. Reports from the mission spread across squadrons faster than sensors could contain them. Pilots started tweaking their throttles, adjusting manifold pressure beyond the red line, trying to fly like Raines. Some wrecked their engines. Others came back grinning, swearing their planes had more fight in them. It wasn't about horsepower anymore. It was about rebellion. In London, engineers at Rolls-Royce caught wind of the event. One designer, Henry Rudston, supposedly said, "If a sergeant in a hangar can pull another 200 horsepower from a Merlin, we should hire him, not court-martial him." But the official verdict came back 2 weeks later. Unsubstantiated performance claim. Engine damage due to operator negligence. No further investigation required. Malloy received the report in the mailroom, still stained with oil from his hands. He laughed so hard it echoed through the entire hangar. "Negligence," he said. "That's one word for progress." The Army had buried the miracle, but they couldn't unmake it. Every crew chief on the base had seen the results. Every pilot who'd flown near Raines swore the Outlaw Mustang moved like it had jet wings. And years later, when engineers began studying high-performance piston tuning for early jets, they found Malloy's fingerprints all over the concepts. Variable supercharging, pressure-cooled manifolds, adaptive fuel blends. He never got credit, he never asked for it. But every whisper that followed said the same thing. There was a mechanic in Leiston who beat the sound barrier with his hands. Summer 1945. The war in Europe was over, but in the quiet hangars of Leiston, the ghost of an outlaw engine refused to die. The base was half abandoned now, the air filled with the smell of oil, rain, and something fading, the sound of machines that no longer needed to fight. Malloy stayed behind during demobilization, packing crates of parts that would never be used again. The hangar that once roared with engines now echoed only with the clank of his tools. On the wall still hung the hand-lettered sign he'd scrawled months earlier. "Speed is faith plus fire." Most of his fellow mechanics had shipped home. Some joined factories. Some didn't make it at all. But Malloy wasn't done. He kept tinkering, kept listening. The outlaw in him couldn't stop chasing what everyone else called impossible. One evening, a colonel from Wright Field showed up unannounced. He wasn't in uniform, just a plain jacket, clipboard under one arm. "You're Malloy," he said, "the man who broke the Merlin." Malloy looked up, unbothered. "I fixed it too." The colonel nodded. "Your engine's being studied stateside. They can't explain what you did." Malloy smirked. "Good. Then they'll keep looking." The colonel paused, then said quietly, "Between you and me, you pushed that engine into transonic airflow. It shouldn't have lived, but it did. You changed something in the way we think about propellers. The Air Force is moving toward jets now, but the principles you uncovered." He trailed off. "They'll use them." Malloy didn't look impressed. "As long as someone flies faster because of it." When the colonel left, he handed him an envelope. No letterhead, no stamp, just a single folded page inside. It read, "Unacknowledged contribution to performance research. Experimental Propulsion Division, Wright Field, 1945. Malloy pinned it to the wall beneath his old tools. For weeks afterward, ground crews who remained swore they could hear strange sounds late at night. The cough of an engine turning over, the faint whine of a supercharger, even though every plane had been grounded. Some said Malloy was running secret tests again. Others said it was just the wind through broken hangar doors. But one thing was certain. Whenever the lights flickered across Hangar 12, there was always a shadow moving between the wings. A man still talking to machines no one else could hear. When he finally shipped home to Kansas, he left behind no paperwork, no schematics. Just one note carved into a workbench with a screwdriver. You can't outlaw instinct. Decades later, when Air Force engineers revisited the archives to study the evolution of high-performance piston engines, they found fragments of reports from Leiston. Engine serial numbers that didn't match production records, fuel ratios that violated chemistry, flight speeds that broke air resistance models, all of them traced back to one unregistered signature, F. Malloy. And though his name never appeared in official histories, the pilots remembered him. Men who'd flown Mustangs into the jet age spoke of a mechanic who made engines sing, who taught them that sometimes the difference between life and death wasn't steel or science, but the madness of one man who refused to stop trying. The legend lived on, whispered through hangars and airfields around the world. Whenever an aircraft climbed higher or faster than it should have, someone always said, "That one's got a little Malloy in it." The war ended, the world moved on, but legends don't fade when they're built on defiance. Frank Malloy returned to Kansas with a single duffel bag, a photograph of Rains beside his P-51, and hands permanently stained with oil. He never wore his uniform again. Never talked about Leiston. He fixed tractors, repaired trucks, and sometimes tuned crop dusters in a field that smelled like wheat and rain. But when he heard an engine misfire, he'd smile, because even after everything, he still knew the language of speed. For the rest of his life, he refused recognition. When local reporters once asked about his war service, he said, "Just kept some birds flying." What he didn't say was that those birds had flown faster than any piston plane in history. 20 years later, when Lockheed engineers tested the SR-71 Blackbird's engines, one of them mentioned a strange pattern in the early research logs. Combustion curve identical to an unauthorized field test from 1945. The initials beside it, F.M. Malloy, never knew it. But the math he scribbled on a fuel drum in a frozen hangar had become part of the foundation for supersonic flight. His madness had quietly rewritten aviation. Meanwhile, Jack Rains never stopped flying. After the war, he became a test pilot, still chasing horizons no one else would touch. He kept a single thing on his desk, a bolt from the Outlaw Mustang's engine, mounted on a wooden base. Beneath it was carved, "Speed equals faith plus fire." Every few years, Rains would visit Kansas. The two men would sit in Malloy's barn, drink coffee, and talk about nothing. Once, Rains asked, "You ever miss the sky?" Malloy grinned. "Nah. The engines still talk down here. They just whisper slower." When Malloy passed away in 1969, there was no obituary, no medal ceremony, just a funeral at a small country church, attended by 3 men who knew the truth. One of them, Rains, placed that same fuel drum note, the one that started it all, into the coffin. It read, "If it breathes, it can fly. If it flies, make it faster." A decade later, when aviation historians pieced together declassified test data from WWII, they stumbled upon unexplained readings. A P-51 Mustang recorded at Mach 0.95, 30,000 feet above Germany. The pilot, Lieutenant J. Rains. The mechanic, unknown. Officially, it never happened. But legends don't ask for permission, because some revolutions don't start with generals or scientists. They start with a man in a hangar, staring at an engine that everyone else gave up on, and daring to believe it could still go faster. Frank Malloy's forbidden engine didn't just outrun Germany's jets. It outran doubt itself, and somewhere beneath the Kansas stars you can almost hear it. That deep, impossible roar of faith and fire cutting through the night.